Very well. It's now that look like so much.
sitting quite close to each other, aren't we?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Take them around.
Yeah.
Want to go back at the time?
No. But if we lock eyes, it's nothing sinister.
How about romantic?
Yeah. This, I thought, looked like Hollywood. So one I've got is I've got the Harry book, and I've still got the Sarah book, so that's one step. That's the other. That's quite slim.
And briefly, they are Kutaiba Fairhana, Neil Mercer, who will be joining us shortly. He is the head of chambers at 33 Bedford Row. Rhys Davies from Temple Garden Chambers, May Al-Hudari, and Ben Keith, who is a barrister at 5 St Andrews Hill. In 2019, Saudi Arabia has detained up to 67 individuals of Palestinian nationality who have been living in Saudi Arabia legally, some for decades. These individuals have been detained for months without being informed of the reason for their arrest, without charge, without coming before a judge, and they have been interrogated without lawyers present. Not only have there been gross violations of their fundamental human rights to a fair trial, but there have been allegations about their treatment and conditions of detention. with allegations of torture, inhumane and degrading treatment, and lack of necessary medical care. This treatment of Palestinians in Saudi Arabia must be viewed in the context of the role that Palestinians have played throughout the Gulf region, where they have lived and participated in urbanization, the oil industry, and their own progress in educational, cultural, and economic and political affairs. In Saudi Arabia, Palestinian nationals have had a strong presence in the oil sector as well. This is evidenced by the fact that many Palestinians living and working in this industry were granted citizenship and acted as advisors to the royal family. The widespread detention of Palestinians in Saudi Arabia over the course of last year shows that these historical ties have begun to change, particularly with shifting alliances in the region between Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and with the United States, as well as the Trump administration. It is believed that these changing political factors and variables have affected the rights of Palestinians living not only in Saudi Arabia, but other countries in the Gulf region. Here to speak to you today about the continuing human rights violations are barristers working with the victims of arbitrary detention and disappearances. You will hear from them as they give more details about the violations and legal remedies under international law to address these violations. As already mentioned, we also have family members of the detainees who will be Skyping in. The first is Kutaiba Ferhana, who will speak first, and then we will move on to Rhys Davies, who is a barrister at Temple Garden Chambers. He is an experienced international criminal law and human rights practitioner based in London and The Hague. He has particular experience of in-country legal advice and assistance, most recently in the West Bank, and has a specific interest in the Middle East and rights of journalists. He combines his international work with a busy and diverse domestic common law practice. Rhys will be addressing the rule of law and availability of the judiciary in Saudi Arabia and giving further information about his clients. May Al-Hudari will be speaking just after Rhys, also a family member of one of the detainees. We will then have Ben Keith, who is a barrister at 5 St Andrews Hill Chambers. He is a leading specialist in international crime. He has extensive experience of appellate proceedings before a variety of courts, as well as applications and appeals to the European Court of Human Rights and the United Nations. He has particular expertise in human rights and extradition proceedings and is sought after to represent politically exposed persons in extradition and immigration. He will be addressing the role of the international community in addressing this issue and further remedies under international law. Neil Mercer, who is our head of chambers, will be joining us shortly, and he will be speaking last. He is going to speak on behalf of Ide Dijkstal, who is my colleague, also a barrister at 33 Bedford Row. Unfortunately, she was unable to be with us today. Ide represents 3 individuals who are detained in Saudi Arabia. She has a wide practice in international criminal and human rights law before international courts and tribunals. Neil himself specializes in criminal law with over 30 years experience in the field. And he will tell us about Ide's applications on behalf of her clients in relation to these issues and further legal applications that will be submitted. Neil will also address human rights abuses being perpetrated and legal complaints that will be filed before the United Nations. I will now pass on the microphone to Reese, or is Ms. Farhana going to be Skyping in?
Should we do me first? I think is that
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
Thanks very much, and first of all, thank you to 33 Bedford Row for hosting us this evening, and to Mohammed from the Arab organisation for an introduction to us. One of the reasons that we're here today is that we're going to be talking about the strange and upsetting pattern that's been unfolding in Saudi Arabia over the last few months, and probably up to about 2 years, of Palestinians being arrested arbitrarily and detained without any explanation, without good reason, without communication with their family members. And one of the things that I've been asked to talk about is the backdrop to that and the rule of law in Saudi Arabia. Anyone who's had any involvement in this area will know that over the last 2 years, the attempts of the Saudi regime to rebrand themselves and reposition themselves as a modern, Western-facing, pseudo-democratic abider of the rule of law have failed, and failed absolutely. When I was asked to talk about this topic, I thought it's too easy sometimes for us to sit here and criticise the failings of Saudi Arabia. But I want to make it clear that we're not here today as enemies of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and we're also not here as politicians or supporters of any particular political cause. The reason we're here today is because we are human rights defenders, and it doesn't matter whether it's the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia or any other state. It doesn't matter whether or not people are being targeted because of their membership of the Muslim Brotherhood, or because they are associated with Hamas or any other group. It is a straightforward matter of human rights, and the situation that's unfolding at the moment in Saudi Arabia is a classic human rights failing. Everyone knows about the Khashoggi scandal, which unfolded over the last, I think it's just over a year now. And one of the ways that has been approached and dealt with by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is symptomatic of the way they deal with any legal matter. We know from the outset in that particular case that at the start they lied and lied and lied, and then they told us that there was an investigation and there wasn't an investigation, and then they charged some individuals, and we don't know who those individuals are, and then they started to conduct a trial, and we don't know what's happening in that trial. All we really know is that probably those individuals are scapegoats, and we also know that the system in Saudi Arabia, I would describe it as being broken, but actually that rather tends to suggest that it was in working order at some point in the past. And actually, from what I've seen, and I'm not an expert on Saudi Arabia, but from what I've seen, there has never been a sensible application of the rule of law in Saudi Arabia, notwithstanding international pressures. And I'm not going to talk about international politics, but again, anyone who's been watching what's unfolded in Saudi over the last 12 months knows that they were in the doghouse for a bit, but it seems to some extent that you-know-who has let them out of the doghouse and back into the big house. But what we have seen, and this is, it's all part of the smoke and mirrors of what's taken place, is we saw that those apparent attempts at reform, women driving, some dissidents were released from prison at about the same time as the ban on driving was lifted. But of course, that came at exactly the same time as people who had in fact been agitating for the right to drive were imprisoned. We see the arrest of bloggers, we see the arrest of clerics who are viewed as dissident clerics. We see a failure to respect the rights of migrant workers. I can't, off the top of my head, remember the number of foreign workers in Saudi Arabia, but it runs into the millions. Those of you who are familiar with the way that it works there will know about the kafala system, so that system of sponsorship. And that is a system which is routinely abused. It's a system in which, for example, passports are seized, they have exit visas, so you may not leave the country without permission in those circumstances. What we also know is that torture is endemic. They of course have the death penalty, but they have brutal examples of torture. It's used in police custody, it's used as a punishment, it's used to extract confessions, it's used in the prison system. And so what we see are the basic freedoms that one would expect in any nationality. I'm not imposing, I hope, a Western outlook here. What I'm talking about is a basic application of the rule of law, and it just doesn't exist. We see crackdown after crackdown, and we see arbitrary arrests for political reasons. We also see, and I think this is important, we see the consistent use of confession evidence, which is used in capital trials in situations where the confessions have been obtained by torture, where confessions have been withdrawn, but nonetheless they are often used as a central plank to convict people in the trials that I've spoken about. And as I say, one of the difficulties with this situation, the situation both in respect of the rule of law generally, but also in particular with reference to these Palestinian prisoners who've been detained, is everything is done behind closed doors. So what we have is this pattern of arbitrary arrests. And we've seen, I think the figure that's been cited was a figure of about 60 or 67 people. There's plenty of credible evidence to suggest that the numbers of people who've been detained are far greater. We don't know for sure because these people are being snatched off the streets, they're being arrested at airports, they're being imprisoned without notification, without their family members being told. And we don't really know for sure the true numbers of individuals. Now, Elaine has mentioned the links between Palestinians and Saudi Arabia, and it's right to say that there is a well-embedded, long-standing Palestinian community that exists and is present in Saudi Arabia. But for whatever reason, MBS, who has been particularly adept at cracking down on dissidents, and I say dissidents in inverted commas, he's been particularly adept at that. For whatever reason, certain elements of the Palestinian community are now being targeted and they're being arrested. And as I mentioned a few moments ago, I know that others will speak on this later, the specifics of what are happening to these individuals. But these are the classic manoeuvres of a totalitarian state. You have individuals who are probably being targeted because of some actual or perceived political affiliation. And as I said at the outset, we as lawyers and anyone who's a humanitarian does not care one jot about the political affiliation of individuals in this context. What we care about are that people's basic rights are being respected. We're pragmatists. We do not regrettably expect what I suppose I would term the kind of Rolls-Royce or gold standard of humanitarian rights, because frankly that doesn't really exist anywhere. It certainly doesn't exist necessarily here. But those basic rights and freedoms are being trampled upon because of political manoeuvring. I hope that gives some sort of backdrop to the rule of law, again, in inverted commas, in Saudi Arabia at the moment. I think Ben and others will speak in due course about what's going to happen. What we are hoping to do in overview is to take some of these cases, some of these families, and make submissions to the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention and other of the mechanisms at the UN. This will be, hopefully, a broad-ranging, well-publicised attempt to bring pressure to bear through all the appropriate mechanisms at the UN and elsewhere in order to secure the release of these individuals. If a crime has been committed, then these people should be charged. If there is no crime, then they should be released. They, at the very least, should be held in reasonable conditions, and they should be allowed to have communication with their lawyers. They should have communication with members of their family, and justice should be seen to be done. Individuals who've been caught in this trap are in a Kafka-esque situation. The reality is that there have been, over the past few months and years, individuals who've been released, and they've played this game quietly. They haven't said anything. and they have been lucky because they have been released on the whim of the Saudi authorities. Unfortunately and realistically, that sort of approach will not work for everyone, and that is why individuals who are in this trap are now seeking legal representation to get out of it. And you'll hear in a few moments' time some Skype calls from the families of the people who have been sucked into this situation, and no doubt they will express it in far more detail and far better than I can. But in short, we have a situation where the rule of law is not in any real sense there in Saudi Arabia, and we must act in order to ensure that these individuals who have been arrested without charge and detained without charge indefinitely are released or charged forthwith. I think I'll leave it there and pass the microphone on to
Neil.
you. There we are.
Thank you, Rhys.
Yes, well, I'm afraid I missed some of that, so I'm probably going to cover some of the same ground. But what we're dealing with since the beginning of 2019, there have been extremely worrying reports about a series of arrests and long-term detentions of individuals of Palestinian nationality and descent living in Saudi Arabia. Some have lived and worked and raised families in the country for decades. Among the 67 individuals known to be in detention, we've been instructed by families of 3 individuals who've been held in detention in a manner and under conditions which clearly indicates their detention is arbitrary, and there's been a fundamental abuse of their human rights, which are being violated without any oversight, accountability, or recourse. Now, the information about what these individuals have endured during the detention, which in some cases has exceeded 9 months, highlights a desperate situation for them, for both them as individuals and indeed for their families, as they try to get information about the reasons for their detention and try to get basic fundamental rights, which are usually guaranteed in most parts of the world to all detained persons under rights and treaties. Details of the treatment and conditions for some of these individuals have been reported by family members, and it's a very disturbing picture of human rights violation, which we are going to submit in due course is worthy of international condemnation, necessitating an official finding of wrongdoing by bodies such as the United Nations. So individuals arrested without cause or in a manner being consistent with being what's euphemistically known as disappeared, who continue to be held for as long as 9 months without charge, and which itself suggests intervention is needed under international law. But further, the failure to provide prisoners with legal representation, including during interrogations, and denying them the right to be brought before a judge or court or other tribunal. These are gross breaches of the fundamental rights of due process and fair trials. Disturbing accounts of severe psychological and physical torture and of emotional pressure placed on detainees held, for instance, in solitary confinement are themselves not just serious breaches of their human rights, but also may amount to an international crime. Now, Saudi Arabia disappointingly, is only a signatory to a very limited number of human rights treaties. It's often regarded as providing the most fundamental and basic guarantees to its population. But there are a few legal instruments for which provide a framework to analyse the treatment of these individuals in detention and pursue accountability. So Saudi Arabia is a signatory to the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment or punishment, which expressly obligates the Saudi government to prevent cases of torture in prison. To also respect the rights and protections set out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as adopted by the General Assembly, including the right to a fair trial, to an independent and impartial tribunal, the right against arbitrary detention, and the right to an adequate health care and the right against arbitrary interference with family, privacy and home. Now, these are all rights which Saudi Arabia is at the moment obligated to respect. And this is why the families of these detained people are seeking legal remedies under international law to address these violations and enforce these rights, and have looked for recourse to the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. Complaints on behalf of a number of detained officials will soon be filed, which ask the UN body to determine whether continued detention of these individuals can be deemed arbitrary and on what basis, whether they must be released. The working group has said detention is arbitrary when there is no legal basis for the detention to begin with, and also when the person's rights to a fair trial were violated with such gravity that it gives the detention an arbitrary character. And this is the reality for those individuals who are detained. So appeals will also be made to the UN Special Procedures Mechanism to ask for the relevant special rapporteurs to raise their concerns about the continuing violations in their periodic reports to the UN Human Rights Council and to the General Assembly. So through these actions, legal actions, we seek official recognition of the human rights violations suffered by those detained, which must immediately cease. And Saudi Arabia must be called upon by the UN, both bodies and experts, and the international community to release these individuals and to investigate their detention that they've suffered and hold to account those responsible for it. Now, the treatment that some of the people have described is being kept awake, made to stand for 8 to 9 days, lights being kept on all night, sleep deprivation, being beaten, denied medical treatment that they need, their homes been ransacked, property, money, valuables being taken and simply kept by the police, being hooded, that kind of thing. And some people have been kept in solitary confinement for extended periods. So it's all very serious. Interrogations without lawyers, perhaps conducted in the middle of the night when the person is extremely tired, being hung upside down for prolonged periods, being kept awake perhaps for 8 days is what one person reported, having the lights continually on, only being fed very small quantities of food at intermittent periods, which creates a continual feeling of starvation. So those are the kind of things that have been reported, that is going on at the moment, and that's some of the things that we're trying to deal with. And so that's why these actions are being launched. So if I can pass the microphone back.
Thank you. I will now allow Kataiba Farhana to speak. Yes.
So people can see the screen actually.
It's okay, you can stay here. I stand the microphone.
Oh, sorry. I thought it was the.
It's okay. قتيبة تفضل. تفضل تكلم.
نعم، أنا قتيبة عبد الرحمن فرحانة، ابن الصحفي عبد الرحمن فرحانة، صحفي في جريدة السبيل وموقع الجزيرة نت سابقا. عبد الرحمن فرحانة صحفي عمره 62 عام.
So I am Qutayba, the son of Abdurrahman Farhana, and Abdurrahman Farhana is my father, who is of 62 years of age, and he's a journalist who had worked for the Al-Sabil paper as well as Jazeera.net in the past.
والدي أيضا كان صحفي غير متفرغ وكاتب في عدة صحف سعودية، منها صحيفة المدينة وصحيفة عكاظ السعوديتان.
My father has also worked as a journalist in Saudi papers, for example, the Medina paper, as well as the very well-known Ukaz paper, as a journalist.
اعتقل والدي بتاريخ 22 فبراير 2019 بالقرب من مطار الملك فهد في الدمام المنطقة الشرقية من قبل قوات الأمن.
My father was arrested on the 21st of February 2019, close to the King Fahd airport in the eastern province.
طبعا تم توقيف الوالد على طريق المطار وتم اعتداء عليه لفظيا في تلك الوقت وادعوا أنه سارق السيارة.
He was stopped by unarmed, ununiformed officers, and he was asked to stop while he was driving along with his brother in the car, and said that he apparently was driving a stolen car.
ثم سيق به إلى المنزل في تلك الفترة وتم تفتيش الوالد والمنزل بشكل كامل.
Then he was driven in a police car to his house, where he found that it had already been surrounded by other police cars and security guards, and then he was taken into his house, which was being searched by the security.
عند الانتهاء من التفتيش وأثناء الاعتقال وضع قطاع على رأس والدي لحجب الرؤية مع نزع النظارات الطبية عنه وحرمانه من أخذ أي متعلقات شخصية من المنزل.
After the search in the house was completed, they put a hood on my father, and they didn't even allow him to wear his normal prescription glasses, nor take any of his personal belongings with him.
والدي يعاني من مرض السكري والضغط ونقص التهوية في الدماغ فلم يسمحوا له بأخذ أدويته الخاصة.
My father suffers from diabetes, and he also has high blood pressure and a condition where his brain doesn't receive enough oxygen or something like that.
بقي والدي قيد الاختفاء القسري لمدة 8 أشهر انقطعت أخباره خلالها تماما دون موافاتنا بأسباب الاعتقال أو مكان اعتقاله.
My father had been in this forced disappearance for 8 months without us being informed of any allegations nor of where he is being kept.
قيل لنا أنه راجع في سجن اسمه سجن أمن الدولة في المنطقة الشرقية لكن أنكروا أنه متواجد في ذلك السجن.
We were told after that my father was at a prison called the state security prisons in the eastern province. However, when we went there, we were told that he is not there.
بعد 8 أشهر تم السماح لنا بالاتصال على الوالد لمدة 3 دقائق. تم السماح لنا أيضا بترتيب زيارة له في نفس السجن الذي ذكرته سابقا. كانت مدة الزيارة 45 دقيقة.
We had received a call to speak with him for 3 minutes after these 8 months, and then a visit was arranged for us when my mother went to visit my father, and she was allowed to stay with him for 45 minutes at the same prison facility.
كان في خلال تلك الفترة المختفي فيها في الانفرادي وتم السماح لنا بزيارته عندما ذهب للسجن الجماعي طيلة تلك المدة طبعا.
Until that time, until we had visited him, he was kept in solitary confinement, and after that moment onwards, he was then brought back into the imprisonment with other inmates.
تم السماح لنا بزيارة مدتها 45 دقيقة بعد 8 أشهر طبعا، والزيارة الثانية كانت بعد 2 شهرين من الزيارة الأولى وكانت نحو 3 ساعات.
We were also permitted to visit him 2 months after that, so that's 10 months afterwards, and in that visit we were given 3 hours time to spend with him.
الوالد في الزيارة الثانية أخبرنا أنه تعرض للتعذيب النفسي والجسمي في خلال اعتقاله في انفرادي في خلال فترة اختفائه قسريا.
My father then informed us that he had sustained torture both psychologically and physically while he was kept in the solitary confinement.
أيضا خسر من وزنه أو فقد من وزنه حوالي 25 كيلو.
He also lost 25 kilograms of his of body weight.
لم يكن يأخذ دواءه في تلك الفترة، مما اضطر لأخذه لأكثر من مرة إلى المستشفى أثناء التحقيق معه خلال فترة احتجازه.
He was not permitted to take any of his medications to such an extent that he became so ill that during the interrogation process meetings he had to be admitted to hospital on more than one occasion.
هناك مكالمة تقريبا أسبوعية من جديد سمح لنا بها لا تتعدى 5 دقائق.
We have also now been granted a weekly call to speak with him for a maximum of 5 minutes.
إلى الآن لم يعرض على محكمة أو يقدم له تهمة ولم يوجه له شيء إلى الآن طيل تلك المدة.
And until now we do not know what the allegations are, and nor has he been presented to any judicial body or court.
أبي في خلال 40 سنة كان له سجل نظيف، لم يخالف أي قانون في السعودية، إقامته كانت قانونية.
My father, during his 40 years of stay in Saudi Arabia, he has a clean criminal record. He's not known for anything in breaking any of the rules or the laws of the state.
والدي أيضا عامل في مؤسسات شبه حكومية، إحداها افتتحها أو أنشأها الملك سلمان عندما كان أميرا للرياض.
My father had in fact also worked for quasi-autonomous NGOs, and one that was particularly started off by King Salman when he was the Prince of, or the Crown Prince of Riyadh.
وأخرى افتتحها الملك فهد قبل وفاته.
And there was another particular organization that was also he used to work for, that was initiated by another member of the royal family.
في النهاية كانت التحقيقات حول مواقفه السياسية فيما يتعلق بقضية الفلسطينية وما فعله للقضية من دعمها له من خلال الجمعيات الرسمية والجمعيات غير الرسمية.
He also informed us during the interrogation processes, he was questioned about his relationship and any material support that he may have provided relief organizations or charity organizations that are working in Palestine.
كل ما أريد قوله في النهاية أنني أطالب بالإفراج عن والدي الصحفي الذي لم يرتكب أي جرم خلال إقامته في السعودية، علما أنني من مواليد السعودية ونمكن لها المحبة. نناشد السعودية بإطلاق سراحه، ونناشد المملكة الأردنية الهاشمية برأسها الملك بالسعي للإفراج عن وعن كل المعتقلين الأردنيين في السجون السعودية على دون ابتداء هذه الأسباب.
And all I would like to say in conclusion is that I appeal to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, to the King of Saudi Arabia, to the King of Jordan, that they look into the case of my father and release him, for he has not been accused of any crime, and we believe he is innocent. We have no hatred or any animosity or any political stance towards any of these states. All we want is our father to be released and for him to be back home safe and sound.
شكرا لكم وممتن لحملكم هذه القضية وإثارتها.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. I think now we'll move on to Ben.
Thank you very much. Am I the last speaker? There was somebody else.
No, there'll be somebody Skyping in just starting.
Okay, thank you. Well, which case I'll wait for somebody else to wrap up what we've said. But one of the reasons we're here is because there has been forced disappearance and arbitrary detention on a massive scale in Saudi Arabia. Currently, we know of 67 Palestinians who have disappeared or been arbitrarily detained in Saudi Arabia, and a group of us here represent a small number of those, and are intending in the next few weeks to take those cases to the United Nations and any other bodies that we think appropriate. These arbitrary detentions and disappearances should be placed against the background of recent human rights violations in Saudi Arabia. Rees has already spoken about the Jamal Khashoggi killing in the embassy in Istanbul, but earlier this year the International Bar Association issued a report on the use of the death penalty and how at that stage Saudi Arabia had carried out a set of mass executions, 134 executions back in the summer of this year. Many of them were political activists, and some at the time were children. So this disappearance and detention of, so far as we know, 67 individuals is extremely worrying, because we don't know what the next step is. These individuals have not been detained under any legal process that we know of. They have not been brought to trial. They have not been charged. They have not been told why they have been detained. They are simply disappear, and then weeks or months later reappear or tell their family that they have been detained in a particular prison in Saudi Arabia. They have no access to their family, their friends, their papers. They are repeatedly tortured and mistreated by their captors. One of my clients has been detained for a number of months and was interrogated by 13 different interrogators during the first few days of his arrest. During that interrogation, he was questioned repeatedly again, as the gentleman before explained, in relation to his opinion on Palestine, his movements, and where his money came from in terms of payments, and whether he was working with any NGOs in the Palestinian territory. So there is clearly a bias against the Palestinians in Saudi Arabia at the moment, and they are using all the organs of state repression in order to detain, arrest, and we don't really know what the outcome of this is going to be, whether it will involve them being sentenced for some crime that they are yet to be accused of, or may well hopefully be released. Our job as lawyers, as Rees has explained, is not to make any political points about who they are or what they've done. Our real concern is that there is no legal process in place at the current time, and these people are disappearing without any disappearing and being detained and tortured, and there is no legal process in which we can access in Saudi Arabia in order to help them. So what are we trying to do about it? So our job as lawyers is to raise the awareness of the mistreatment of people in Saudi Arabia, and particularly this group of individuals. And whilst we think it's 67 at the moment, there may well be many, many more that have not come forward. There is some question as to whether many of these detainees have been asked not to make complaints for political reasons, but we would encourage anybody who has family members who've been detained or has disappeared to contact the Arab Organisation for Human Rights to see whether we are able to help you any further. We are going to write to the United Nations in order to raise the issue and ask them to conduct a full investigation. We're going to start with a working group on arbitrary detention, who will, we hope, conduct an investigation into the issues that we raise and ask Saudi Arabia for some explanations as to where these people are and why they are currently detained in custody. We also hope to raise this matter with a number of the different special rapporteurs, those special rapporteurs on forced disappearance, on torture, and any other legal remedies that we can find at our disposal that will mean that our clients are able to be released soon, return to their families, and that a legal process can actually take place. Because at the moment, these people are held in horrific conditions, tortured, away from their families without any accusations against them. This, unfortunately, has been a pattern for a number of years, although it has not specifically been targeted against Palestinians until recently. Some of you may have read about the issues in the Yemeni conflict, where Saudi Arabia and the UAE removed prisoners from both those countries to secret black site prisons in Yemen, where even worse torture occurred. We don't know whether... So for many of these individuals, we don't even know if they're necessarily still detained in Saudi Arabia. The rule of law, if it was ever there in Saudi Arabia, is no longer there. And this specific targeting of individuals for no proper reason and with no legal force means that the United Nations must intervene. The Khashoggi scandal raised the profile of Saudi Arabian torture and human rights abuses to the top of the international agenda. The UK talked about not engaging further in arms deals and trade with Saudi Arabia, and there was widespread condemnation. However, that anger soon subsided, and it was only a few months after that that international relations began again to allow Saudi Arabia to host international conferences and for world leaders to engage in diplomacy there without any real consequences for Mohammed bin Salman or his cohort, who are thought to be held responsible for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Against that backdrop, there has been no real consequence to the Khashoggi scandal, and so Saudi Arabia have continued to breach human rights of individuals on a massive scale. As I said, we have a huge number of executions this year, many of them we consider to be arbitrary, and some against children. We have, as I said, 67, but it may well be many more Palestinian individuals who have disappeared. And the pattern described by the previous speaker is typical of being stopped at an airport or a border or a roadblock, hooded, disappearing, being taken to a prison, and then months later, 2 months, 3 months, 8 months later, managing or being allowed to contact your family for a very short amount of time. In the interim, the Saudi authorities torture and treat with complete contempt the people who they have seized. So I'd call upon the international community to re-examine the relationship with Saudi Arabia and ask the international community to put pressure on Saudi Arabia to release these Palestinian individuals, or at least allow them to undergo a legal process whereby they are either charged or released from custody. We also ask that the United Nations consider the cases and ask Saudi Arabia to explain what has happened and put pressure on Saudi Arabia to release these individuals and at least allow them to be subject to a proper legal process, rather than essentially removing any rights or legal remedies from those individuals. As I said, we hope to launch some of these in the next few weeks. If there are any more people who have family or friends who have disappeared, please feel free to get in contact with the Arab Organisation for Human Rights and add your voice to those of the people that have disappeared already.
Thank you, Ben. Are we able to
Yes, I think so. It's your turn now, okay? Just a second, put in loudspeaker. You're on speaker now.
My name is May Al-Qudari. I'm the daughter of Dr. Muhammad Al-Qudari and sister of Dr. Hani Al-Qudari. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk regarding the arbitrary unlawful detention for my father and brother from a humanitarian perspective. Both of my father and brother were detained on April 4th in Saudi Arabia. There was no reason given for this detention. My father, Dr. Muhammad Al-Qudari, who's 81 years old, and there's serious concerns for his health as he has been detained for 8 months while he was being treated for cancer. My brother, Dr. Hani, has 5 kids and he's the only supporter to his family. We learned from both of them that they were detained for the first 3 months in solitary confinement. While both reported that they were not subjected for any form of physical abuse, but the detention and isolation was emotionally abusive and caused lots of pressure. As of now, they were not provided any lawyer, non-charged for anything. My family and I are seeking your influence to put a limit to this unlawful detention and let them back to us as we need them and they need intensive care and treatments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There will be no more speakers. I am very grateful for everybody who attended today. It really is a very dire situation, and I'm glad that it is being exposed, and I do very much hope that the international community does get involved and that some progress can be made.
But in particular, I think what we're really hoping is that these cases at the UN will draw international attention, because although these are not binding on the Saudi government, we all know that cases and findings at the UN are deeply embarrassing. Countries can't simply ignore the United Nations completely. And so it also gives some comfort to people in Saudi Arabia that people outside care, that there is a due process outside Saudi Arabia, and that at least we are doing our best on their behalf to try and expose what's going on and to try and pressurise the Saudi government simply to behave properly. That's all we're asking. If these people are guilty of criminal offences, then let's see the evidence. Let's have them charged. Let's bring them before courts. If they're being detained for improper reasons, because their politics aren't liked, well, let's hear that. Well, let's have them released, because that isn't a proper reason anywhere to detain somebody. But what we're not picking out is any of these people are engaged in any criminality. They simply are intelligent people of Palestinian origin, and they appear to have been picked on at the moment. And that's not acceptable anywhere. So thank you all very much for coming.